I thought I was shooting at him when Brett was standing right behind him.
Okay.
All right.
We good? I'm going to go.
I think we're good.
Let Dr. Bunn
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of Daniel and Scott, I welcome you to their senior paper defenses. If I don't know you, my name is Daniel Bunn, and I've had the privilege of working with these two and reading their fantastic work. I'm eager for them to get to share with you. So the way this will go, I'm going to open with prayer, and then Daniel will open. He will present his paper and introduce you all to what he's saying and what he's arguing, what he's been working on. Following that, we will have a time for questions, for discussion, for commendation. So as you hear him presenting, be thinking of questions you might have for him or words of commendation you might like to share with him. Once he's completed his turn, then we will turn it over to Scott. So that's the way we will proceed. So without further ado, I will open with prayer and then turn it over to Daniel. So if you would, please bow your heads and join me. Merciful Father, we thank you for this day. I thank you for each person who's taken time out of their schedules to be here to support Daniel and Scott this step in their journey. I thank you for the faithful work they've put in, not only to this particular project, but their entire time here at ORU. All of that in service of you and the vocation you've placed on them and the love that you have shared with them. All of this is an honor to you, and I know that all that they do is in service to you. Be with them now as they prepare to present. May the peace and wisdom of Christ be with them, and may this be a time of celebration. May we all learn as we share in this conversation together. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Amen. All right.
For those of you on Zoom, I will likely be out of frame for a good portion of this because I need to click the button. Actually, yeah, let's adjust that real fast. Thank you, Scott. All right, so today I'm going to be presenting on the idea of intertextuality in the story of David. For those of you not familiar with this term, basically we're asking the question, is the Bible quoting itself? Is David using the words of a man named Jephthah from the book of Judges? And if so, how does this affect how we understand his character? How does this affect how we understand his motives? So, there are a very important question here. The first one is, how do you know if a quote is actually a quote? Because there are a lot of common phrases in the Bible, like, he did what was right in his own eyes. That shows up all over the place. And just because it's used more than once doesn't mean that so-and-so is actually quoting this guy who used it over there. So how do we go about judging when it's a purposeful allusion made by the author? The second main question is, how does this quote change the meaning of the story? Now, before we jump in, let me give you the story. For those of you who don't happen to have 1 Samuel chapter 24 memorized off the top of your head. The basic story is, David is running from Saul because Saul is seeking his life, right? So he runs to the land of the Ziphites, and the Ziphites say, hey, David's hiding here. So Saul comes along with 3,000 men to try to find David. Now, because of God, Saul can't find David. But it just so happens when Saul decides to take a break and use the restroom in a cave, he happens to pick the cave where David is staying in the back. David's men say to him, hey, you should really kill Saul right now. David gets up and seems to do so, but instead of killing him, he just cuts off his cloak. Saul leaves the cave, David goes out after him, and then David gives this beautiful, huge speech. The gist of which is, look, I haven't sinned against you, but you are seeking my life to kill it. I've done nothing. Why are you listening to these men? May the Lord judge between you and me, but I will not touch you, for you are the Lord's anointed. Saul realizes that he's a jerk, Saul says that he's a jerk. Saul says, surely you'll be king, and then we move on. End of story, split ways, happy ending. Sort of. But the thing that intrigues me about this is that in the middle, David seems to use the words of a guy named Jephthah before he promises Saul that he won't kill his children. And Jephthah happens to be famous for killing children. So, let's dive in. There are 4 ways that we go about deciding if something is a quote. Now, granted, there's more than just 4, but there are 4 that are applicable to this study. The first is, are the words the same? If the words aren't the same, you don't have a quote, because that's kind of the definition of a quote. Second, is it reasonable to assume that the author of the book you're reading knew about the book that you think he's quoting? Because if he didn't, then he's not quoting it. Third, and here's the important one for this study, how does it change the story? Authors don't just quote people willy-nilly for no reason. There's usually a purpose. If it's not purposeful, then it's not an authorial allusion. They just happen to be using the same words. They have to want to reference somebody. And it has to have some type of visible change in the story. And then finally, the the criterion of recurrence. If someone quoted this guy 15 times already in the previous chapter, it's reasonable to think that he's doing it again. But if this is the only time in all of Scripture that someone seems to be quoting this guy, you have a problem, because that's not very common. So, these are the criteria we will be using to judge whether or not David is doing a quote. So let's start with the basics. What are the words that I'm claiming are a quote? Here they are. Jephthah said in the middle of a speech, I have not sinned against you, but you are working my evil to make war with me. May the Lord, the judge, judge today between the sons of Israel and between the sons of Ammon. All right. David says, and I have not sinned against you, but you are seeking my life to kill it. May the Lord judge between me and between you. Now, you guys can probably realize that these are not exactly word for word the same. They're obviously somewhat different. But these differences can be broken up into categories. First category, words that seem to be changed between the two. Second category, words that are present in one that are not present in the other. So let's go ahead and look at the words that are changed. Here we have, you are working my evil to make war with me, versus David going, but you are seeking my life to kill it. These fill the same spot, even if they aren't the same words. And then we have the sons of Israel versus me, and the sons of Ammon versus you. Now this one really doesn't matter, because David is talking to Saul, and it would be really, really, really weird if in the middle of talking to Saul, he suddenly referenced a foreign nation out of the blue. This just kind of makes sense. So we can take that difference and go, okay, they're basically saying the same thing. The question is, can we take the difference between working my evil and seeking my life? And can we say, well, those are saying the same thing? If we can, then there's reason to think that there could be a quote here. So, I forget what the next slide is. All right. If that's the next slide, then I need to cover this information here. So, the important thing to know about Jephthah's speech is that he is making a formal war declaration. And in the ancient Near East, formal war declarations had very specific meanings for the words they used. In this case, the word we're interested in is evil. This here is part of a structuring system in the ancient Near East known as retribution. It was a way that they saw the world and a way they structured their history. Basic idea, you do evil, evil is done to you. Now this can be by God himself. This can be by a human agent who is really acting for God. And in this case, that's the context we're worried about. Human people seeing evil and on behalf of God enacting retribution on the people who did evil. So that is the phrase that Jephthah's using here. This is the word for evil that he's using. But if you'll notice, he starts with, I have not sinned against you. Here we have the context for the speech. Ammon is claiming that Israel stole land. Israel, in fact, did not steal the land. Ammon said, you stole the land. You did evil. Therefore, we're making war against you. Retribution. Jephthah's saying, no, actually, we didn't steal your land. We didn't sin against you. Therefore, the retribution that you are trying to enact is not valid. Therefore, we call the Lord to judge between us. That is the ancient Near East setting for Jephthah's war declaration. So the question is, can we find the same setting for David's speech? We don't find it in David's speech, but we do find it in Saul's response. Saul responds to David's speech saying, wow, you're right, I've sinned against you. And then he goes, may the Lord meet you out good. The phrase, let's see, Yishalemcha Tova, on account of that which you have done to me this day. And I know that you will surely be king, and the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand. Now, a lot of people look at this and go, Saul is claiming that David will be king. This is just pure propaganda. Let's throw this out, let's say it didn't happen, and let's just ignore this because it's obviously propaganda. That is actually kind of a stance in the academy. However, in light of ancient Near East retribution, this makes total sense. His use of those specific words right there mirrors exactly the Akkadian use of the exact same roots to structure retribution. This one right here is from Zimri Lim, found in Mari. And he says, Atamrim, for whom I have done so much. He has demeaned me. In the face of good deeds, he has returned evil ones. And then he plotted only wicked things. God has called him into account, or called him to account. The exact same phrase used by Saul. This is a common phrase in the ancient Near East. This is just an example of a letter that uses it. So Saul is structuring this in the idea of retribution. I did evil to you, but you did good to me, so may God mete out good to you. All right. But why does he say, I know you will be king? He says, I know you will be king because in the ancient Near East, kingship was predicated on doing good. If you did good, if you honored your treaties, and you didn't commit sacrilege, you would remain king. Meanwhile, if you committed sacrilege, broke your treaties, and did not do good, you would not remain king because God himself would yoink you. So, that is the context for Saul's response. Saul's motivation for saying, surely you will be king, is based off his understanding of the good that David has done to him in light of the evil that Saul has enacted on David. So, Saul understood this as Saul messed up and did wrongful retribution. The question is, did David? This speech fairly clearly says that David did. And now, my father, see, even see the corner of your cloak in my hand, which I cut the corner of your robe and did not kill you. Know and see that there is no evil, retribution, or rebellion, breaking of the relationship between the Lord and the vassal, in my hand. And I have not sinned against you. But you are seeking my life to take it. In this phrase, you are seeking my life is standing for a wrongfully enacted act of retribution. The exact same thing that Jephthah is claiming that the Ammonites did. So in this context, to seek the life is mainly just a clarification of what David means by what is the evil that Saul is doing. The evil that Saul is doing is trying to get retribution by seeking life. So in these contexts, seeking life is synonymous with working evil. So all the phrases that are changed do have a one-to-one correlation with each other. They are not wildly changed things. They are saying the same thing using different words. So, what about the words that are added? Oh, whoops. There we go. these are the added words. I'm using the word added just for the sake of convenience here, by the way. I'm not claiming that they were actually added in. I'm just saying they're in one and not in the other because that's easy to say. So, here are the main differences. The word I, that is not a huge difference. The word the judge, that shows up there. Now granted, while that is a difference, David does call on God to judge using the exact same root as the word the judge, so it's not a huge difference. And then Jephthah wants to make sure that you know what's happening today. I don't know about you, but in my judgment, these are not crazy differences. This is not like a wild clause like, but you hit my mother. If that were shoved in there, that would be reasonable to say maybe they aren't talking about each other. But these are the only words in the entire thing that are added in to Jephthah's and not in David. On the basis of this, we can say that the verbal parallel between the two is reasonable. It's not certain, but it warrants further study. So we have to ask, how did David use the quote? If David used the quote and it's kind of set off by itself, that's great news for me because that looks like he's just kind of quoting it. Unfortunately, he did not. This phrase that I'm studying is split between two different verses. The first verse has its own parallelism, and it goes, see the corner of the robe in my hand. Clause. For I cut the corner of your robe. Negation. And I did not kill you. Second half. Know and see. Once again. Clause. That there is no evil in my hand or rebellion. That should be or, not and. And then another negation. And I have not sinned against you. And then he adds in this contrastive addition at the end. But you are seeking my life to kill it. The weight of this falls right on this last phrase. So the first half of the phrase we're studying is fully integrated into the verse before it. This makes it difficult to say that he's actually quoting. It could be that it was edited in to be smooth like this, or it could just be that the guy was writing. Both options remain open to us, so we have to look at some other things. For example, yes, that's basically what I just said. Was the source available to the author? Now, to do this, I have to answer the question, who's the author? Which gets a little complicated, because no one really knows who wrote Samuel, or when, or, well, there are plenty of theories. Let me say it this way. Everyone seems to know who wrote Samuel, and everyone seems to know when. And I'll be darned if David's court, Josiah's courts, Hezekiah's courts, every court seems to have written the book of Samuel. And it is just wonderful for someone trying to get a straight answer. So, let me give you an overview of some of the conversations here before I basically say, we genuinely don't know. So, the first thing to know is that chapter 24 is not the only time this happens in the book. The exact story that I told you, and every bullet point here, happens again 2 chapters later. Now, it seems a little odd, if you think about it, that Saul would promise to not kill David, or tried not to kill him, and then 2 chapters later, he's trying to kill him again. Not only that, but no one mentions the fact that Saul just promised not to kill him. Even more than that, David's men go up to him and say, hey, you should kill Saul. Even though 2 chapters ago, David very clearly said, I will never kill Saul. This seems a little odd. Not to mention the exact verbal parallels and exact phrases that show up in both accounts. We seem to have duplicate accounts. So if I'm trying to date the passage, I have to ask, well, which one came first? That might help me try to narrow down the range. Unfortunately, everyone has a different opinion about which one came first. These are just a few big names because I don't want to basically kill you guys. So, he's an old guy. He's an old German guy, and it was the thing then to say, Pentateuchal source theory. There are 5 different editors, or however many different editors you want, in the book of Genesis, and they happen to be here too. So why do we have 2 different accounts? Well, one source wrote 24, the other source wrote 26. But 26's source sucked, and the Bible writers wanted to kick it out. So basically, they took the stuff from 26, shoved it into 24 where they thought it would matter, and then they said, whoops, we can't actually get rid of 26 because, well, he never explains why they can't. But for some reason, they can't. So they shove it back into the book and go, well, darn, we have two accounts right next to each other. We can't have that. Let's shove 25 in there. That is literally his theory. That was a little rough, honestly. That was a fun theory. So let's move on to the next guy, Koch. Koch said, okay, we have two stories, right? Let's treat them like two stories. So maybe one story developed over here in an oral stage, and one story developed in a different geographic location. Because everyone knew the story, but once you split up and once you repeat a story a few times at Thanksgiving, things start to change a little bit. Eventually, the editor of Scripture said, oh, well, I don't want to leave out so-and-so's account, so you know what? Let's go ahead and put these in. And for some reason, someone felt the need to make them similar. So for Bud, I like to say Bud, the differences between the chapters, no, pause. Yes, the differences between the chapters come from editing. For Koch, the similarities come from editing. So they view different parts of the chapter as more original than the other. McCarter came in, and he said, well, I have this fangled new theory that I'm working with, known as the Deuteronomist. And we have defined exactly, they think, what he's doing in the book of Samuel. We like to say this guy came in at the later date and added these specific speeches because they sound similar. So that means they must have been edited by the same person. And so basically, he had the same theory that this guy did. He just came up with it later after we had the idea of the Deuteronomist. And he just rephrased things. Now, I know that y'all really don't care about this. And I'll be honest, I'm starting to agree with you. However, this is why people say, oh, it was written during the time of Josiah. No, it was written during the time of David. He holds David, he's more in the realm of Josiah Hezekiah era. Because they have different attributed motivations for the author based on their hypothetical reconstruction of how they think the book was put together. And then based off what they think the author's trying to do, then they assign a court for him, and then they move on with their lives. All this to say, we don't really know which one came first yet, and there is no consensus in the academy. However, there is a sign of an editor in the chapter. So let me tell you a story. Saul walked up to David, and David's men said, hey, you should kill Saul. David says nothing, immediately stands up and goes over to Saul and cuts off his cloak. That's a little weird. But he puts his hand on him and cuts off his cloak. And then he comes back to his men and says, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing. You see the problem here? We have an interruption in the story. We have, hey, kill Saul. Okay, never mind. I'm not going to do that. So there's a little bit of a there's a little jar here. So people have tried to figure out what the heck is happening here. This guy, Bunn, suggested that some editor really had a bad day. And he mixed up like 5 of the verses in a row and basically wrote them in the margins, and then they got switched around, and then they got flip-flopped. And basically the story should read, hey, go kill Saul. I'm not going to kill Saul. Stands up, cuts off his cloak, supposedly so he will have a testament of the fact that he didn't kill Saul. And then he walks out. That would be nice. But also, it's impossible to explain how that happened. Other scholars have looked at this and gone, what do you mean they wrote it that messed up? It kind of falls apart upon further inspection. Now, Smith, he was more consistent. Smith said, okay, I see what you're doing. This is an interpolation. Someone just shoved this in there because they wanted to make sure that you knew that David was innocent. So they created this whole cloak thing out of thin air, and they said, hey, you know what would be great in the middle of the speech? What if he had like his cloak in his hand? So they went back and they just shoved it in the story. Now this theory actually holds up. I'll be completely honest. There is pretty good evidence that this cloak is an addition, which matters for us because the quote that we're looking at says, look at the cloak. So if the beginning of the verse says, look at the cloak, then chances are it's a later addition. Now, I am running out of time, so I'm going to have to blitzkrieg this. All right, let's talk about what difference does it make. There are two options. Either David is purposely quoting Jephthah, or the author is making David sound like Jephthah, even if David doesn't know it. Now, for option one, that doesn't quite work, because David's speech is all about, I'm innocent, I'm innocent. And Jephthah's speech is all about, I'm going to kill you. It doesn't quite work. So we can kind of throw that option out with the bathwater because it really doesn't work. However, what if the author wants to make you think it could be? David's character in this story is full of contradictions already. He said, oh no, I cut off the cloak, I feel horrible. But in the speech he says, look, I cut off the cloak and didn't kill you. What a wonderful guy I am. So the question is he being genuine? Did he actually feel remorse, or is he taking advantage of his political rival? Both options genuinely are open in this story. The book is open-ended. It doesn't give us any clear definitions. Not so with Jephthah. Jephthah, he was an outcast. He was not a judge. And then the people said, we need someone to fight for us. So Jephthah said, you know what? I'll do that if you make me your leader and if you make me the head of all Gilead. So he kind of manipulated them into making him a judge. And then he manipulated them into making him confirmed by God in a public ceremony. And then, in his declaration of war, he goes, hey, God, remember what you did for Moses? You better defend what you did for Moses, because you're not going to forget Moses, are you? Oh, and let me mention that I'm the leader and that I'm actually leading these people. So now, if you want to defend Moses, you have to elevate me. His declaration of war is actually a very carefully constructed manipulation of God in order to try to force God to defend his people and therefore work through Jephthah. Then we have what he's most famous for. Jephthah, in the middle of the war, said, God, if you let me return victoriously from conquering these people, I will sacrifice as a burnt offering the first person I see when I go home. You did hear me right. He said that he would sacrifice a human being if God would confirm his power and appoint him as leader, as a victorious general. Now, little did Jephthah know that the first person he'd see when he went home was his daughter. She bore the consequence of his pride. And then the end of his life, the Ephraimites came to Jephthah and said, hey, why didn't you include us? And instead of being, courteous and kind, Jephthah basically said, hey, it's my war. What do you even care about it? Screw off. And so the Ephraimites went to war. It was a bloody civil war. Tens of thousands were massacred by the river. And that is the history and the legacy of Jephthah. So, if that's who Jephthah is, a political creature who will take any chance to get an advantage and confirm his power through manipulation, what are the results of reading Jephthah into the character of David? Suddenly, David sneaking up on Saul, while it is the sign of his innocence, is also a sign that he had power over his enemy. David cutting the cloak is proof of his intention to use the situation to his advantage, even if he's not willing to be labeled as a king killer. In this reading, David's promise to Saul to not kill his children is immediately suspect. especially considering the fact that he does eventually kill all of Saul's children, except Mephibosheth, because he liked Jonathan. He kept it for Jonathan, but not for Saul. So immediately we see that David becomes an ingenuine character, and that we should be suspect of him, so that the following stories about him desiring to shed blood lead us to see the beginning of his moral downfall at the height of his power, rather than at the beginning of 2 Samuel when he sleeps with Bathsheba. Second implication of reading Jephthah and David. Jephthah is famous for having killed his daughter. And this is the chapter where David promises to spare Saul's children. I've already covered this, so I'm going to move on in the interest of time. Now, just because a thematic connection can exist doesn't mean it has to exist. So the question is it common to quote Jephthah? And unfortunately, when I researched this, do you know what I found? I found out that most people are not interested in writing commentaries about intertextuality. Genuinely. I found one book. Now, that might be a problem on my end, I will admit, but out of the 50, 60 things I combed through, I found one. And that one book was a brief overview of the entire Old Testament. So it was not very in-depth. In fact, it only referenced 5 things from the book of Judges in the entirety of Samuel, 1st and 2nd. So basically, I do not have enough data to say whether this is common or not. So, to wrap this up real quickly, is this a quote? Well, as far as the verbal level goes, it could be a quote, but the integration of the quote makes it questionable whether it is. So it's inconclusive. It's probable, but it's not very likely. The available source to the author, that is unverifiable until we have a complete reconstruction of the editorial process of the books of Samuel, which was slightly beyond the scope of this paper. Thematically, there are strong thematic indications that work well within the narrative arc of Samuel. But just because they work well doesn't mean we can read them when we want to. So we leave that with probable. And then finally, with recurrence, we have insufficient data to move on. I had meant that section to be like a 10-page section of my paper, and it ended up being barely 1 page, because that's just the amount of research that was out there on this. So, I would propose that we do some more research on this, that we go and see, hey, if we start David's moral fall with a reference to the judges, does David get painted as one of the judges later? Samson. There's some rumblings out there that David sounds like Samson in certain parts. Is he ever quoting Samson? Is he ever painted as Samson? How is David painted when he kills the children of Saul? Are there references to the book of Judges in those sections? That is a question for further research. If there is, then we can fairly confidently say that this is a reference to the judge Jephthah that is meant to create a narrative arc between the promise that David made and the breaking of his promise, so that through this entire thing, we can see this as the character arc of David's fall that runs in parallel with Saul's fall. So, that is basically my paper. That is it.
All right, we'll open it up now. We'll take a handful of questions as time allows. So if you have questions, raise your hand, and Daniel, you can
Try to
control
answer. Oh, question.
Can you talk more about how you can see at the beginning of David's downfall before Bathsheba in 1 Samuel? That's really interesting to me.
Absolutely. So, to go in a little more depth about this. You know how I mentioned that we had 24 and then 26, and they seem to be duplicate accounts? The thing that's in the middle adds to this thing. So, we have David making a promise to not kill the children of Saul. But that's immediately suspect because, well, David said, I cut off his cloak, and Saul said, don't cut off my children. And we're like, well, you already cut off the cloak, why wouldn't you cut off the children? So there's already some tension in here. This quote of Jephthah would just intensify that tension. And then the very next story that we have, very next thing, Samuel dies. And then David goes around, almost like a mercenary, trying to strong-arm people into giving him stuff. We don't even know if he deserved the stuff. That's never specified. He just basically says, give me your stuff, I was good to you, even though we have no record of him being good to him. And then the guy obviously says, no, I don't want to. And David says, I'm going to kill every single person in your household. And so he starts to head out to go kill every single person in the household. But God intervenes and stops him and says, no, don't do this. And as if this isn't enough, David then specifies and clarifies. He says, if the Lord had not sent you, I would have slaughtered every single person in that household. So right after a chapter where David is professing with big flowery speeches, I will not kill you, I will not take vengeance into my own hand, I won't kill your children, we have him taking vengeance into his own hands and trying to kill people in the very next chapter. So that creates this tension, the question of, will he keep his promise? And we know that at the end of the story, he doesn't. So we can view this as, how did David get from making the promise to breaking the promise? That is the story of his downfall. That is the story of his moral corruption that would be introduced. So it doesn't start with Bathsheba, it starts with the uncertainty in the reader that makes us question, how is he going to turn out?
Just a small thing. In your added words section, you said that the word I was added in, but they're in both. Is it different in the Hebrew or something?
Yes, it is. Let me just point to that for you. And there we go. So there are two ways to express the word I in Hebrew. There's the word I right there, and it's just its own word. More often, though, it's just a form of the verb, and the verb form used only happens with singular people saying I did something. So it does mean I did something, but it doesn't have to have the word I by itself. Jephthah has the word I all by itself. David just puts it in the verb.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, I noticed the parallels that you noted, and given that Jephthah's statement is basically a statement of he's addressing a statement of war.
Mm-hmm.
Could it also be that David is also making a backhanded sort of, or the author believes that David is making a backhanded sort of statement about war? Because David later, after, I believe it's in 1 Samuel 27 and 28, where David goes out to fight with the Philistines against Saul, but they reject him because they fear that he's going to be a traitor. And David is actually very upset that they rejected him.
Exactly.
So I wonder, is this sort of a premonition of the war between the house of David and the house of Saul?
Okay, so for the first question, is David purposefully referencing someone who's claiming war? That's going to be a no, because David is trying to prove that he's innocent and would never kill Saul. That's the whole point of the speech. So, purposefully quoting a dude who's about to go to war and kill a bunch of people, specifically to enact retribution, in a speech where you specifically say, I would never be a vessel of retribution, doesn't quite work. But the author could be using the phrase to clue in the audience that David actually is at tension and at war currently with Saul. It could be emphasizing the tension between the two, but we hold that lightly until further research is done. You?
Actually, I read a version of this paper, and now I have actually a question. I was thinking the entire time, the question seems to be, is David potentially quoting Jephthah? My question would be, when you looked at the Exegesis tablets, is it that maybe it's not David quoting Jephthah, but that both of these people are simply using language that was already...
Absolutely, that is completely possible. That's why further research is needed. If these weren't common phrases that are used in the time period where they lived, I could immediately go, oh, look at that. But they are. Now, finding them in this order, I haven't found that yet. but they are fairly common phrases. They're common ideas. So that's why I'm saying we need to study the whole arc of David's story to see if there are sprinkles of judges throughout. Because if there are, then it would create this nice little complex where we can say, oh, these support each other. These many references in a row would indicate that this one is also a reference. That work just has yet to be done, because this was a paper over one chapter instead of over about half the book of Samuel. Yeah. All right. Oh.
This is a question about for itself. You did a really good job on this, by the way. But why did you choose this topic? Like, what inspired you?
It's his fault. So, shameless plug. If you get the chance to take one of Dr. Bunn's classes, Dr. Bunn focuses
That's
on...
not going to affect your grade.
Well, I still might as well mention it for the business majors and the mathematics people. There are different types of Bible classes. His Bible classes focus on reading the text and learning how to ask good questions. That's the entire point. Can you ask good questions when approaching the Bible? What question does it invite you to ask? And we were reading along in class one day, and we happened to be on 1 Samuel 24, and I said, ooh, look at verse 16. Could that be a... And I just spouted off something that has absolutely nothing to do with this paper, but it started me on the research process. And then in Dr. French's doctoral thesis, I happened to notice, oh, these are the same phrases. So, thank you, Dr. French, for leaving the trails for me to follow. Appreciated.
You're welcome.
And that's how I got on this topic, was through studying and trying to figure out something completely not related to this at all.
Did you ever figure out what you were trying to figure out for that other topic?
Funnily enough, about 3 weeks ago, I was in Dr. French's office and we were looking at some tablets, and then I actually found something that would indicate that it could have been the thing that I was looking for the entire time, and I said, wow, I wish I saw that a year ago. So, maybe it's possible. Oh wait, sorry, this is professional. It warrants further research. Alrighty.
Any other questions?
Can I ask? Do I get to ask a question?
Sure thing, Dr. Lyons.
If I can get it out. Early on, you seemed to say that the little story about David and the cloak, which is plausible, by the way, if he took the cloak off and laid it aside, that kind of thing, right? So you seem to say that maybe that was a later insertion. But then, a little bit further on in your presentation, you seem to act like this was very crucial.
Yes.
Can you have it both ways?
Yes, you can. So, here's the heart of what I care about in this topic. Just because it's an editorial addition does not make it untrue. The editors are intently aware of the text that they're working with, and they care about the text that they are working with. Each person comes to a text with an understanding of reality, a way that we see things. Now, looking at the redaction and the editorial process in this chapter, just so happened that the verses that he excluded as additions all happen to follow the theme of retribution, and all happen to follow the ancient Near Eastern context and word usage of retribution. So I hold that the author took a story and then through his lens told the truth of the story in a more truthful way. You can edit something to bring something to light. You can edit something to make it communicative. That does not change the reality of the text itself. So I can happily say that this is an editorial addition, and then I can say, and what does that tell us about the story given to the editor? What does the final author of Samuel want me to understand about who David is? His viewpoint is valid. I would even dare to say his viewpoint is inspired and approved by centuries and millennia of tradition. So I can have my cake and I can eat it too. As long as I am willing to say that the editor of Scripture is a valid interpreter who is gifted by the Holy Spirit to interpret.
Couple of additional questions for me, and then I want to share some words of commendation. One is, you've talked about Samuel's interaction with judges.
Yes.
Could you say more as to why that might not go in the other direction?
Now, I got to talk about this a little bit in a footnote on the paper, but I did not get to say this here. Just because you identify that two things could be related to each other, and that there's an intertextual reference, that doesn't necessarily mean you know which way it goes. In order to talk about which way it goes, you need to examine each text on its own to see the effects of reading David into Judges or reading Judges into David. You need to have a full study of these things. So, I cannot give you concrete answers because I was focusing on how would this affect David, with keeping in mind that I would have further studies to see if it was valid in Judges. However, I do have a few preliminary things. Jephthah's thing starts as its own sentence, and the entire sentence is the phrase that we're talking about. It's great. It's nice and set off, and it's... David's thing is integrated into two separate sentences and split by a nice little pause in the thought. So, if someone were to be trying to quote David, that would be a really weird way to do it. By snipping two sentences in half and then smushing them together to have it stand as the climax of your own speech. In addition, the phrase that we're talking about in David, it doesn't show up as the climax, it's actually just shoved into the middle of the speech. Whereas in Jephthah's speech, absolutely everything is building up to that final sentence. Boom. Without that sentence, Jephthah's speech falls apart. But without this phrase, David's speech kind of still works. Not gonna lie. It's a little bumpy, but it's not what happened. Where's the story? Why aren't we understanding what's happening here? So, that is not concrete proof as to why it's not Judges, but those are a few of the indications and the few things that caused me to lean towards choosing to study David more than choosing to study Jephthah.
Thank you. And one final question. What would you say your biggest takeaway from this whole project has been?
I find beauty in this. My biggest takeaway is that I can interact and I can speak to and I can even in some points identify some of the motivations of the editors. That I can dig in and find whispers of who the character of David is. He's not static. This is not just some little painting. David is a man full of contradictions. And the editor creates these tensions and this pulling so that you might actually see that he was a real man. Because if you'll examine yourself, I'm sure that each and every one of you will find inconsistencies in your character. You will find contradictions in your motivations, and you will find tensions in your life. I find beauty in the tensions that are created by this text because it shows me that there is truth and that this story isn't just some stained glass window. This story is the story of a real man whose life has been illuminated by countless, in that I actually don't have the capacity to count them, people. I said that's my biggest takeaway.
Thank you. A few words of commendation. First of all, at an academic level, I want to commend you for your work with engaging such a wide range of fields. I mean, you've engaged the Akkadian, you've engaged intertextuality, the text of Samuel itself, and your work with the scholarship there is commendable. So really impressive work at an academic level. In the midst of all of that, I appreciate, I know you had some frustration with ending so inconclusively.
Yes.
But I want to commend you on that because you demonstrate a great level of intellectual humility. You didn't feel the need to press toward a false conclusion, and you gave a fair and balanced conclusion that could be drawn at this stage of the process and awaiting further research. So I commend you on that. And then finally, you are endlessly entertaining and gifted at standing up in front of a crowd. A class with you versus a class without you is night and day difference. I've enjoyed your presence not only in this session here today, but just in class in general. I encourage you to continue to take that gift seriously. We've all been here captivated by what you're sharing regarding these sorts of minute details in the text. So not everyone has that gift, so I commend you in that. And then above all, as I've gotten to know you over the last several years, I commend you in your devotion to the Lord. I know that you see this as an act of worship, and you've truly pursued it in that way, as you do all of your assignments, all of your classes. So I commend you in that. I know that above all, you are a servant of the Lord, so I commend you in that. So thank you for your presentation today, and let's give him a round of applause. All right, I think we're ready to get going. If you could please take your seat, we'll get going with Scott's presentation now.
Hey guys!
Thank you, Genevieve. All right, thank you all for sticking around. We are now going to turn it over to Scott. So, Scott, the floor is yours.
I'm going to be very honest. I was originally going to present first, but then Dr. Shelton teaches at 4:30. So I'm going to chalk it up to that instead of the fact I was too scared to present after Daniel Hanson. Before I get started, I want to recognize all the people who decided to show up. In case you're wondering, the Calc 3 class wrote up, so I love you guys a bit. And some people from my Portuguese Presided also made it out, so hey! You're about to listen to a grammar paper for the next 30 minutes, so I apologize in advance, and I will do my best to make sure you believe that this was worth your time. Where did the time go against Aktionsart in the exegesis of the Greek verbs? Before I get started, I should probably have my notes. This paper seeks to argue against the use of Aktionsart in the exegesis of the Greek verb. The four hotly debated components of the Greek verb in exegesis today are time, tense, aspect, and Aktionsart. The first section addresses necessary linguistic preliminaries concerning the literature on time, tense, and aspect from the perspective of biblical scholarship and also from the camp of general linguistics. The discussion then will lead into a second section which constructs a fourfold exegetical system, that's what I'm choosing to call it, so FES, consisting of four postulates that will explicitly define how significant linguistic terminology is used in the paper and provide a testable method for identifying the time, tense, aspect, and Aktionsart of a Greek verb. The third section will then be a case study, so we'll do a lot of theory and then we'll test it on an actual passage of scripture. So it is necessary to state here from the get-go that there does not exist universal agreement on the formal linguistic definitions of time, tense, aspect, or Aktionsart. So that's a great start for a paper. Even the concepts of semantics and pragmatics do receive varying treatment in the literature. So the only concept that really has anything remotely close to universal consensus is that of morphology, because we all have to read the same letters. Claiming something to be grammatical is potentially ambiguous without elaboration or context. So one quickly finds that any study of verbs requires assumptions and clarification of terms. This paper asserts that the use of assumed terminology in the study of verbs is fully defensible, for the lack of universal consensus renders such studies to be, in fact, impossible without assumptions. So long as these assumptions are presented, clearly the ideas presented in this paper can be engaged with from a variety of perspectives and sides of the linguistic debates. The choice to call the fourfold exegetical system a collection of postulates comes from my math background, honestly. And it's deliberate because it's actually false to claim that these postulates are or should be considered to be true. That's important. So we need to assume something to write a paper, but I'm not here to tell you that you should accept these as true. The system is going to go as follows. The time of a Greek verb is identified pragmatically. At the present moment, that means nothing to you, and so that's what most of the paper is going to be about, building the construction of these terms. The tense of a Greek verb is identified morphologically. The aspect of the Greek verb is identified grammatically, and then lastly, the Aktionsart of the Greek verb is identified both semantically and pragmatically. Why am I splitting up these 4 ways? Well, it's because I once was a really bad Greek student, and I did not understand how to read verbs. I did not understand a lot of this terminology that got introduced, and then I started exegesis, and it got worse. So over the last about year and a half, I have been personally invested in learning how to read a Greek verb. Potentially for the reason that you can't really read any page of the New Testament in Greek without knowing how to read a verb. So hopefully the relevance of this is somewhat imbued into the fact that you can't read your Bible, so to speak, without knowing how to read a verb. These are the terms that need to be talked about, because if I don't talk about this, we will enter the same vortex of the black hole of scholarship that is ambiguous. We need to know what time is. What do I mean by time? Specifically with reference to the time of a verb. What does that even mean to then be a pragmatic identification? What does it mean for tense to be identified with something with called morphology, etc., etc.? So before I actually was able to enter the biblical scholarship conversation of this, I had to talk with the linguists. I need to engage with a few preliminary concerns so that what we don't do is we don't assume that biblical scholarship are the linguists and then take their assumptions and then tell linguistics what to do based off of what the biblical scholars have decided that linguistics is. A few preliminary remarks. Verbs are hard. And for the fact that I can't actually give this presentation without several thousand verbs, it's a little bit ironic that it's so difficult to understand something that is so not difficult to understand. Material in this section is a survey at best, for the reason that I am an undergraduate student. Demonstrate differences between biblical scholarship and general linguistics. A major part of my mental discord when studying this was because those camps don't agree. I assumed that they did. And then the goal is actually to then just provide some context for why I'm even constructing and trying to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. We'll first look at biblical scholarship on tense and aspect. Porter and Fanning kind of researched this dying flame of the grammatical conversation. And then since then, they've caused quite a stir. A lot of people have written monographs, and this is just a sampling of the representative monographs that were published from the time of Porter Fanning up until the SBL conference in around 2015, when Runge and Fresh then compiled a whole bunch of papers that was done as a collaborative effect so that people could attempt to get on the same page on whether we are going to assume the same things or define the same things or study the verb the same way, specifically with regard to aspect. And I think the reason why we as English speakers take so much interest in aspect is because I'm sure most of you have no idea what I'm even talking about right now. We don't interact with aspect as English speakers. That's not something that is a grammatical component that is everyday common knowledge. I can talk about tense and immediately you have an idea mentally what I'm talking about. Aspect, what is that? Aktionsart, are we making stuff up? Foreshadowing, potentially. Okay. Then we got to go back to Exegesis parade. I really honestly could not do a paper about this if I didn't in any way reference this famous analogy. We learned this in Greek 1. Sometimes we have to relearn it again in Greek 3. And I am now relearning it in senior paper. And so the original analogy was for Slavonic languages. This is Isachenko. He's not talking about the Greek language. The reason why we talk about the parade analogy so much in Greek studies is because Porter adapted the entire analogy to the Greek verb to try to make it more easy to understand. I will talk a little bit more about some of the ramifications of what his adaptation did, but for now, what we can know is that his adaptation of the parade did fundamentally shift the focus away from viewing the perspective of an action as a whole or unspecified whole, and he transitioned that perspective to whether something is continual or completed. And this doesn't sound like a big deal until we start to talk about doctrine and homiletics. And if you listen to a sermon and someone tells you that this verb is in this tense, ergo, you must apply it this way because of aspect, now we have to start talking about that realistically. Because if we're going to assume that that grammatical truth actually bears and is true, then we have to read the scripture differently. And if we read the scripture differently, we have to apply it differently. And if we apply it differently, now we're talking about the way that we live is changed, by how we understand grammar. And so this is not as fateful as it seems, because as we'll see, some of these assumptions that have been read into these studies I contend with. Here are the typical assumptions from the get-go. If you're just going to do a basic exegesis paper and a basic exegesis report, if you see a present tense, we call that imperfective, irrespective of whether or not we have any clue what we mean when we're saying that the present tense is imperfective. When we associate the imperfect tense, not to be confused with the imperfective aspect, aorist and pluperfects are going to be considered perfective for the most part. Over here, the blue and the green, those are pretty locked away, and nobody really argues about that. Where there can be contention is with the perfect tense and the future tense. On occasion, the linguist will have an issue to pick with the aorist tense being considered perfected. But we will get into the history of why that has been in contention from the Stoic Romans. Now let's take a look at general linguistics. I call it versus the verb because it's very appropriate. It's a war that the linguists are currently losing and will never win. And so I do not want to say at any point of this paper that anything has been figured out. Daniel and I were cracking up because we reached the ends of our papers and we both realized that our conclusions, although on different topics, are entirely the same. We read a bunch of books to find out that the people who had the answers have been lying to us. So they don't actually have the answers either. Gender linguistics has no singular solution to our tense aspect problem. And so what I'm going to contend in the paper is more of a logical conclusion. If there's a lack of consensus with the linguists themselves, it would be remarkably pretentious to suggest then that biblical scholarship solved it, right? So any kind of discrepancy that we're going to have or conflicts that we're going to have in just general linguistics as a whole, that's going to have ramifications on the way that we study biblical studies. So that is a key assumption, and it was just a sentence in my paper, but I'm realizing when I was making these slides that this needed to be a slide, because if not made up front, it can be easily lost. The lack of consensus from biblical the lack of consensus with the linguists will result naturally, logically, necessarily into debates and issues with biblical scholarship. So let's step back to time. Thankfully, this is the easiest one, so we think. Aristotle, way back, he's got a twofold idea of time. He says, the present, the now, what are you talking about? It's either happened or we're entering it. And since there's this level of instantaneous, what do we mean by now? I'm speaking to you in the present, but does that mean it's in these atomized blips of infinitely precise moments? Or am I talking about a present time that has some actual duration? And so this was why it was debated way on in the past, and inherently it's actually a very philosophical question. And this is why the philosophers duked it out. Diogenes is going to come by and then put forth what we always kind of assume just by nature. Past, present, future. Trifold time. There's three of them. So this now does exist, in fact. The past can be distinct from it, and that can be distinguished from future time. So there is a problem. We have 6 Greek tenses. And as far as I'm concerned, 6 is not equal to 3 unless you're in mod 3. And so how do we fit 6 Greek tenses into 3? It was really interesting looking into this because really the only situation where you have a modern language that does not have this issue is modern Lithuanian, which they will have their 3 tenses of the past, the present, and the future for their temporal past, present, and future. Basically, every other modern language is going to have a different number of tenses competing and somehow fitting and being sorted under these 3 times. So there used to be ambiguity between time and tense. Those were used synonymously way back then. And so the fact that that really didn't get wrinkled out until the Romance language, so we got Portuguese, we got French, we have all these languages being influenced by this ambiguity before it actually gets resolved. All right. So, the purpose of these brief remarks, I say brief, is to preface the following presentation of the Stoic Veronian theory of tense and aspect and a few subsequent interpretations of the Stoic system that have influenced modern tense aspect theories. Among the earliest surviving fragments of grammatical manuscripts are those that were penned by the Stoic school of Greek philosophy. It was Varro who essentially adapted the Stoic theory to Latin, and although the fragments of his writings do not explicitly propose tense aspect theory, that should raise a few red flags in our mind, the structure of his theory can be inferred. What does that mean? We don't know if that's actually what he said, and we've derived a ton of verbal studies off of a hypothetical reconstruction. So there's that to start. Both Greek and Latin morphology and syntax, they do support the pairing of especially opposed complete and incomplete tenses. So it should be unsurprising that the earliest Greek tense aspect theories do assume a twofold view of aspect. So Varro is on the slide right now. Essentially what we're doing is we're trying to explain a way to have 3 times and then these 6 tenses, but then having aspect involved. In this case, where there is this dichotomy between incomplete and complete, which sounds remarkably familiar to some things that we have assumed today. What I'm going to show you next are 3 tables. And what these 3 tables are is there are scholars who said, all right, so if this is what we think the Stoic, if this is what we think the original Stoics abstracted about their own language, but it's fragmentary, there needs to be some level of interpretation, and they also had problems with the way this categorized the tenses. So they said, let's now have our own interpretations and reconstructions to try to figure out and resolve this tense aspect problem. Holt is going to suggest, okay, it's very remarkably inconvenient that the future and the aorist don't seem to play nice with my concept of aspect. So what I'm going to do is simply say that we can arbitrarily have a distinction between definite tenses and indefinite tenses, where suddenly aspect does no longer grammatically apply to those that are indefinite, and then we'll keep the definite tenses, and then we get our nice even split between extended aspect and complete aspect. So in some sense, this does create a solution. We can talk about these 6 tenses, and we can have them without any ambiguity. However, we have to accept the assumption that that's the way the Greeks viewed their own language, that they decided that only 2 of the tenses just have no aspectual reference in their grammar. Pinborg then says, all right, I don't like the way Holt did that, because that seems like an arbitrary assumption. So I'm going to make an arbitrary assumption myself. And it's that a grammatical system can have empty grammatical categories. In other words, there needs to be no such thing as a complete future. There needs to be no such thing as a neutral present, because there are not enough tenses. So we're now having the opposite problem. We've expanded the conversation to the 3 times. We want 3 aspects. Why did we add those? Because the aorist and the future weren't playing nice. So let's add another aspect, which is going to increase the number of tenses we need to otherwise fill this theory out. We don't have enough, so let's just say conveniently 3 of them disappear. We have no idea why. Again, do these actual identifications technically work, and are they consistent with themselves? They are. But if we're going to base the way that we read the Bible off of this, we have to accept that assumption. Goodwin then says, all right, I like this idea of adding the 3rd aspect to resolve the issue of the aorist and the future. And he does so pretty successfully, because now he only has 1 whole. And the way he does it is he attacks it from the angle of we have actions that are going on, just an action that's taken place, really no reference, and that's really ambiguous as a definition, but I'm choosing to look past that. And action finished, okay? So we have, again, notice that in all of these reconstructions, they are trying to maintain the Stoic Veronian sense of incompleteness, completeness. There's always going to be this 2-aspect system that they were trying to force these things to work into, and it just doesn't seem to be working. And I don't know about you, does that keep you up at night? Because it did for me, and I don't know if I'm embarrassed to admit that publicly, or that's just the math in me. So let's have a few immediate takeaways, because that's a lot of jargon. We need to exercise caution when we're doing exegesis. If we have to exercise caution in linguistics itself, then that implies we should have caution in biblical scholarship. So, if something has not been necessarily determined, if it's entirely kind of hypothetical and inferred, and the best theories we have are then reconstructions of something that's hypothetical, you know what I think we should do to that level of uncertainty? I'm going to assign doctrine to that. And so what we don't want to do is that. Okay? We do not want to do that because that's very damaging. There can be an abuse in the way we use exegesis to teach stuff that we want to teach. For the reason that I made an assumption once in a linguistics book. And, well, that's suddenly now how they viewed their own language 2,000 years ago. So, there we go. Don't base exegetical conclusions on just the tense aspect theory alone. Kind of speaks to the priority of just well-applied hermeneutics. I was very, very surprised when doing the case study with hindsight that just reading it appropriately, coming to the text with the right questions, with the right assumptions, and stripping away of presuppositions, you reach a really good interpretation that doesn't require you to necessarily know exactly how the tense aspect problem resolves itself. So we don't need to lose hope. Even though we don't understand the study of the language, we have brains, and God has given us the ability to perform good hermeneutics so that we can still understand His scriptures. Tense aspect systems are not necessarily, we should not throw them out. If we throw them out, then my entire paper should be thrown out. It is supplementary to exegesis. It can complement what we're doing, but I would no longer make this as primary of a focus as it sometimes is treated. Again, the Stoic system, it's gone. No one's ever getting it. God has the receipt somewhere, and He's chuckling at all of us as we try to recreate this. And then ultimately, the Stoic Veronians, it's hypothetical. Further than that, they didn't finish abstracting their own grammar by the time we even got to the Stoics. So even if we hypothetically were able to get that original Stoic document and see the entire fleshed out theory, that was not completed in its abstraction. So simply, it doesn't exist, they're all dead, we don't speak the language, and it's fine. We have hermeneutics, and we do not base our doctrinal exegesis off of that. The fourfold exegetical system, this is unironically how it felt doing this entire system. This is what you're about to see is what happens when the theology department decides it's a great idea to adopt a pure math major. Because I was immediately very, very frustrated inherently with the ambiguity, the lack of definitional consistency. Papers who decide, we're using this term over here, I'm going to introduce complete new jargon, have no reference to what I meant by defining that, but suddenly my thesis is about it. So if you don't understand it, you do understand it, right? And so that was very frustrating, and so we're going to do this the math way. Postulate 1. The time of a Greek verb is identified pragmatically. There's jargon involved. That's frustrating, so let's resolve that issue. Time and pragmatics. We've talked some about time, but not about pragmatics. The way I'm going to assume time works for the sake of the paper, and again, this is a postulate, meaning you don't have to agree. If anything, I would actually prefer you disagree, because then the conversation afterward will be very exciting. The time of a Greek verb is the temporal reference, so temporally past, temporally present, temporally future, with respect to the speaker's immediate perspective within physical time, and with respect to its use in context. Okay, what does that mean? I am simply trying to just refer to the fact that time is a thing. We are in physical time. You were not in this room 4 hours ago, so temporally past, you weren't in this room. That's all I am talking about with the time of a verb. It is quite literally that physical, dimensional level of time. Pragmatics of a Greek verb, and I did this because it's pedantic, but it needs to happen. I'm including of a Greek verb in all of these definitions, because none of this really, I don't think, would apply universally, and it breaks down horribly with German. So this is only to do with reading the Greek New Testament. Pragmatics of a Greek verb is the application of the verb's textual context and the rhetorical function to understand how the verb is being used by the writer or speaker to express a specific intended meaning. So if I'm going to make a rhetorical choice, and I chose to make a joke a while ago to make you guys laugh and to relieve, some of the stress that is coursing through my veins, that was a pragmatic choice. Some of the way I choose to word things. There are pragmatic choices that go on because there is a textual context. That textual context is what I'm saying right now. There's a rhetorical function. I'm trying to teach you. And I'm trying to convey a specific intended meaning. So the way I convey that is what we call pragmatics. So what does it mean to say that time is identified pragmatically? Well, we figure out which temporal reference we're talking about just from context, from its pragmatic use. So I have here example 1.4, Bob and Sue. I prepped this because I don't trust myself to remember the details of the analogy correctly. Suppose Bob runs errands for his wife Sue, and when he arrives home, he says to her, "I used the self-checkout at the store." It is obvious that Bob's use of the self-checkout occurred in the temporal past with respect to the current moment of Bob's speech. The event of Bob using the self-checkout happened at a specific point of time that has since physically passed. For Bob is telling this to Sue while he's back at home, and presumably he did not defy the laws of physics to return home. The shared understanding that Bob's use of the self-checkout occurred in the temporal past is what this paper calls the time of the verb used in the sentence, "I used the self-checkout." Notice how no reference is made to the tense of used. Yes, we could call that, and you're probably thinking to yourself, used, that's just the past tense. But we're going to see that the tense does not necessarily correspond to the temporal reference. Now suppose that we're Bob and Sue, they're unbagging the groceries. Bob remembers a very frightful incident that he had while using the self-checkout, and he says, "So, as I was putting the ketchup into the bag, a thief comes along, running down the aisle, and is telling everyone to surrender their groceries." Okay, so now I'm telling you this story. Well, Bob is telling you the story. Bob is telling Sue the story with present tense verbs. I am certain the thief is not in their house right now, threatening to rob them of their groceries that they're unbagging. Okay, so, and thankfully there is some consensus about this. Using a tense does not necessarily mean it has to be a specific time every single time. It's called historical present for this particular example. Okay, does that make sense? Postulate 2. Tense of a Greek verb is identified morphologically. Okay? This one is thankfully pretty straightforward, especially for those of you who have taken other language classes. The jargon here is morphology and tense. So the morphology of a Greek verb, I'm simply claiming that's the study of said verb's formation and classification within the language. When you sit down with your Greek New Testament, as you all do every night, you look at a verb, and how do I know that it is a present tense verb? Well, because of the way it looks. I can open my eyeballs, I can remember the tables, I can remember the paradigm. That's the tense. That is really the identification I'm making here. In other languages, the way that you see the endings added on in the paradigm, that has really nothing to do with anything except for the way it looks on the page, the way that it's written. So to claim that tense, which is going to be the morphological categorization of the verb that describes its routine, pragmatic, temporal reference, what do I mean by that? Well, something can have routine time reference. For example, if I tell you a story in the present tense, or if I'm saying, I am currently speaking to you, using the present tense, by default, kind of routinely is used to talk about something temporally now. And that's okay. But as evidenced by the previous example, that doesn't have to be a rule. So while we have a routine, pragmatic, temporal reference associated with the tense, it is not in itself somehow encoded into what the tense is. We can have both separate, distinct, but not in contradiction with each other. We can have time, we can have tense, and by splitting the identification into pragmatics versus morphology, we don't have any contradictions. Let's take a look at sose and lege in Matthew 1:21 and Mark 1:41. Example 2.4, we have Matthew 1:21 saying, Texatai de huiam, kai kaleses ta anima autu isu. Altasgar sose, there's our verb, ton laun autu apa, ton hamartion auton. Okay? So that I need to identify its tense. And the way I identify the tense is morphology. I see its form. I identify the form as it's a future tense form. Morphologically, that's what it is. And it so happens that in context of how it's being used, she will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus. Merry Christmas, everybody. He will save. This is referring to something that is in the temporal future. And so, the tense and the time, in this case, coincide. But what about in Mark? I'm not going to read splagano because I can't say that correctly. So instead of reading the Greek, I'm going to read the English. Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said. But when I use the word said, that's past tense in English. The way I translate that is past tense in English. But lege itself, if you look at its form in the paradigm, it's a present tense verb. So if I were to just read this woodenly with no context, I would say, and saying to him, or I am saying, he was saying to him, I accidentally used the imperfect tense. He is saying to him, I do choose to be made clean. We know that this story happened in the temporal past. So it's nothing crazy to just simply put in the past tense in English, even though we know that that present tense form is referring to something in the past. Again, this is the same exact thing with Bob and Sue, but just now in Greek. Postulate 3. Aspect. Let's actually now talk about the one grammatical category that I am realizing I should have prefaced is probably unfamiliar to most of us. The aspect of a Greek verb is identified grammatically. Jargon, aspect, grammar. The aspect of a Greek verb is the perspective of the presentation of the action. There's two layers of ofs here. The amount of time I cried over how I wanted to word this definition should not be under stress. Okay? The aspect of a Greek verb, it's the chosen perspective. How am I choosing to perceive, or the author is choosing to paint a perspective of the way you're presenting. What are you presenting? The action of the verb. This is nothing to say about whether the action is continuing on. It has nothing to say whether that action finished a while ago. It is simply a perspectival issue, at least how I'm assuming it in this paper, and I definitely recognize that's controversial. The grammar of a Greek verb is simply the set of descriptive rules that govern how the verb's meaning is associated with its form. And after, when I was reading through my rough draft, I realized that putting verb's meaning in there was a mistake. So I clarified. By verb's meaning in this definition, what I'm really just saying is like it's elements of parsing. Okay? So the rules that are going to govern what those parsing elements are, what's the person of the verb? Is this a singular or a plural? Is it the first person, the second person, or the third person? Those kinds of questions are elements of parsing, and those can be directly associated with the form of the verb itself. Okay, so that association, that set of rules, that's what I'm calling grammar in the paper. So to claim that aspect can be identified grammatically is making some sort of claim that I can link aspect to what the verb looks like. I can identify some sort of form, and it has a regular pattern, it has a regular structure in the Greek verbal system. So what I'm about to show to you, not that one, sorry. Oh, I need to clarify, there's two aspects. I am borrowing this from a scholar because I was too scared to come up with my own wording. The perfective aspect essentially presents the action as a whole, while the imperfective aspect essentially indicates only the lack of any such presentation. This may be interpreted either as indifferent to wholeness or as a positive lack of it. This is when the imperfective indicates incompletion, but this is dependent on context. And so I put this from Binnick, and the definition assumes the structuralist view of aspects from general linguistics. So am I taking a side? Yes. Am I at least informing you of whose side I'm taking so that if you want to argue, you can know who to fight and not me? Everybody loves Bunn. I wasted about 30 minutes finding this picture of a dog. I should have been preparing my slides. And what I need to tell you about is something called grammatical opposition really fast. It's a very simple concept. If I say puppy, then you all know that's a baby dog. If I say dog, could I look at a puppy and say that's a dog? Yes. Could I look at a puppy and say that's a puppy? Yes. Okay. Could I look at a dog in general and say that has to be a puppy? No. Okay. So in the opposition, we have a marked member. The marked member is puppy, puppiness, versus a dog. That does not mean that they are opposites. Is a puppy the opposite of a dog? No. Does puppy imply the opposite of dog? And does dog imply not puppy? Okay? This is what we've chosen to typically assume in biblical scholarship for the way aspect works. Okay? Puppies cannot refer to dogs because it's marked. You can't take the specific marked version to refer to the unspecified marking. But we can use the unspecified marking, and it could make reference to something marked. Actually, we should not talk about that yet. So, perfective versus imperfective. Here's the analogy. This puppy is the perfective aspect. Aw. This dog is the imperfective aspect. And so, if I say that the perfective aspect is marked, all I'm assuming in this paper is that it is the one that specifies something. What does it specify? Precisely what the structuralists assume it specifies. Action as a whole. Presentation of aspect, or the action of a verb as a whole. If I choose to mark that, then what does that make the imperfective? Does that make the imperfective the opposite of marking? No. It doesn't make it the opposite of the perfective aspect. It just simply means this is the unspecified one. So could I use a verb with perfective aspect to refer to a verb with imperfective aspect? No. But could it possibly be that imperfective verbs could technically, in some context, without contradiction, refer to something marked? It could. And that's what we find. And there's a lot of different categories and tables of exceptions to grammatical rules when I suggest that the linguists have a solution to at least that dilemma. And that's using grammatic opposition. Okay. So this, I was very happy to finally make this. Essentially, I am now coming along and suggesting this is the Alon's interpretation of the Stoic verb. I'm kidding. But in this sense, I'm now extracting time away from the conversation. Because if time is pragmatically identified, why grammaticalize it? So now I don't need to come up with an arbitrary category to make the aorist work nice or the future to work nice, but rather I can actually just say these 6 tenses work as 2 pairs of 3 tenses each. I have 3 perfective and 3 imperfective tenses. What does that mean? That simply means that 3 of these group tenses mark, they specify completion of the act, or not, viewing the action as a whole, versus just simply not. The present tense doesn't need to. The future tense doesn't need to. And what I really like about this particular theory is that there is the use of the future perfect. Well, but why would that be? Isn't that a perfective thing? But yes, that's okay. There is no contradiction to the definitions. For the imperfective could make reference to the marked without necessarily always being that way. So the ambiguity between the future tense, mostly referring to something that we've decided to unspecify its perspective versus marking it with the future perfect, that is technically consistent. So what I'm not saying that this is the answer. What I'm saying is that if we decide to accept the definitions that this paper has assumed, this is in fact a logically consistent solution to the tense aspect problem. Is it the correct? Is it the solution? No, actually I'll probably tell you, I'll change my mind about this in probably 6 months. But from the definitions that we have, it does logically follow. So I can at least have a closed paper and get a degree. Okay, 4th postulate. This is where things are going to go a little bit off the rails and you're going to probably disagree. Aktionsart of a Greek verb is identified semantically and pragmatically. Immediately, it broke my parallelism. I was mad at the Word document. Everything fell apart, and I was emotionally unstable when realizing that at the very end of my entire case study, it fell apart. I rewrote this paper in 3 days because it was wrong. I inherently believed that Aktionsart had a role to play here. And why did I think that? It's because that's what grammars are telling me to assume. So, what is Aktionsart? It's a German word. Literally just type of action. Okay? So the Aktionsart of a Greek verb, description of a type of action of the verb that relates the verb's lexical meaning to its pragmatic use and context. Semantics, what do I mean by that? For this paper, I'm simply saying semantics of a verb, it's just the inherent meaning of the verb. What does that word mean in that language? Boom. That's the semantics. So, here's an example. To punch. How I felt about Aktionsart. There are 2 different ways I could put it. Why do I need to include both semantics and pragmatics? Well, it's because if I say, I punched a tree and hurt my hand, we know that that instant of punching happened only once. But if I now say, I'm at the gym punching a bag, the type of action hasn't changed. It's still a punch. But we all know from context, from the rhetorical intent, the pragmatics, that punching a bag means you're doing it more than once. In other words, the type of action has now changed from something that iterates to a single punctiliar moment. So the fact that we could have two types of Aktionsart for one lexical form immediately makes it not really grammatical. It makes it more of a hermeneutical thing. And then also, that's kind of subjective. And depending on which scripture you're reading, and which we'll show in the case study, you can really, really change the meaning and force or conclusions of how you read a passage based off of subjective choices and how you assign the type of action. So let's recap, because that was a lot. Time, pragmatic. It's a rhetorical effect. It's just a temporal reference. Tense, morphology. I open my eyes, I read, document. It's there, that's what it is. The aspect is grammatical. That means I've associated specifically with the form of the tense, as seen in that one table. And then Aktionsart is going to be this horrible amalgamation of what the word actually means and what we understand it to mean, but then also situated within a context. So we're going to actually get to the scripture now. Reading Luke 5, 1 through 11 as a case study, I chose this passage for sentimental reasons because it is what I consider a convergent passage for me. Here's the way I'm going to do it because I'm running low on time. I'm going to show you the data, and then on a few of the slides, demonstrate why I believe Aktionsart as a category is subjective and should not be necessarily a priority in exegesis. Who's to say that that's the ingressive at the case study? Who's to say that that action started and should be assumed to continue? I have to interpret the text before I can even make that categorization. Compare that to the fact that all of the other categories, like the time and the tense and the aspect, follow immediately. This is going to follow verse 3. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, asked him to put out a little way from the shore. And he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. What kind of questions do we have to ask? Say, let's look at, he sat down and taught. Tons of problems in just those few words. He sat down. Okay, well, if I'm going to grab a chair and sit down, this is not iterative. I am not bouncing up and down on the chair, repeatedly sitting down over an interval of time. So I can intuit that the type of action there has to be somewhat punctiliar. But then what about teaching? Do I mean to present that he taught, as in just the summary element of he was teaching? Is that the type of action here? Or is the type of action, it's continual, it's progressive, because to teach this entire presentation, it needed to occupy a duration of time. So that actually is a completely different type of action that is a valid way to read this verb. Another valid way to view it is punctiliar. It's in the past. It happened. He taught them. So that is a subjective measure compared to its grammatical components. And so all of the Aktionsart and choices were interpretive on my part, which is why most of them are wrong. But all of the grammatical components of this have to be necessarily true by the way that the language works in grammar. These are the receipts. This was not really fun to make, and it's probably not fun to look at. But this is just to say, I went through every single one of these verbs and tried to make the most objective possible identification of the type of action, and it just failed every single time. Who's to say that those are summary verbs? I mean, when you read this, when they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. Following, well, the lexical form of that could imply that there is some level of duration. But I don't mean to, it's been painted to me in the past, so should I view it as I'm summarizing what happened in the story and that's now the type of action? There's a lot of problems with it. So, here's some concluding remarks. Here's what's transpired in the last 40 minutes. We've surveyed some linguistic issues, we constructed a theory, and then we briefly looked at a case study to evaluate said theory. Here's some strengths. There is a potential solution, and as a math person, that made me happy, even if it's probably wrong. Because what it does is it presents Greek verbal systems as having 3 times, 2 aspects, 6 tenses. And from the algebraic perspective, a theory that I was not able to flesh out in this paper because it is not remotely biblical literature whatsoever, is there's a very interesting pattern between Cartesian products of sets of grammatical components spitting out, and those product spaces are actually the grammar structures. That's what we get these tables from. And so that's why this is really satisfying, is because we have a Cartesian product that actually works. It's a 2 by 3 that spits out 6 tenses. Tense is not required to be a product of time and aspect. This is the mistake, in my opinion, of what the other theories were trying to do. They were trying to make the 3 times and these 2 aspects do the hard work of getting to 6 tenses. But the problem with making time do that legwork is that it was inherently pragmatic. That is, it's not a subjective grammatical measure. Both camps tend to overlap on the issues of most of these jargon points: time, pragmatics, morphology, grammar, semantics. So where they do differ, and particularly with time, tense, and aspect, I am prioritizing the perspective of the linguist over the biblical scholar. Because linguistics has to do with the way the language inherently works. Biblical scholarship often tries to make a theological point out of the things that they study. Here's the weaknesses: the entire paper. More specifically, the definition of Aktionsart. Early warning signs at the definitional level that this was not going to be fun were immediate. And so when I made the definition, I kind of crossed myself and I prayed, Lord, I just need to submit the paper. Campbell's, I took his Aktionsart because they were conveniently in an index for me to use, and it was a great way to objectively run something as much as possible against a case study. The only problem is that nobody actually agrees that he's right. Okay? Siebenthal actually adds another aspect onto that called the derivative, and then he doesn't even include half of Campbell's other Aktionsart. So lots of these categories kind of don't exist, actually. So what? We talked maybe for 5 minutes about actual scripture in this entirety of the presentation. Why does this even matter? And why did you come and listen to me talk about 3 different grammar theories and why none of it's right for now? Right? It's because we are to read the scriptures. We are to understand and rightly divide the scriptures. What's in the scriptures? Tens of thousands of Greek verbs. There are 4,449 verbs alone in the Gospel of Luke and the NA28 Greek manuscript. So if we can't read almost 4,500 words that contain very, very important information about the way salvation works, about the person of Jesus, about his teachings, about the ramifications of our obedience and servanthood, if we don't have an appropriate way or the right questions to ask about this, suddenly that does matter. So although all of the nitty-gritty details of the linguist don't need to be done by everybody, because speaking from personal experience, it's not worth it, okay? But we have to be grateful for the fact that people are actually attempting to solve this problem, because based off of their conclusions, we are able to then take them and rightly divide the word. I want to acknowledge everybody who decided to show up today. I am very, very thankful. That's perhaps the biggest miracle is not me finishing this 2nd degree, but that I convinced a bunch of people to come to a grammar paper. And I want to acknowledge Dr. Shelton. We had a lot of excellent conversations. Excellent conversations. Didn't always agree. And actually, you helped me fix a lot of parts of my paper because you caught when I was very sloppy with some of my definitions. Definitely thanks to Dr. Lamb. I bugged you probably 18 times this semester, and you never pretended to be annoyed. So I really, really appreciate that. We had a really good time. Thank you to Dr. Bunn for being flexible with the fact that the way I write papers is really annoying to professors, and for allowing me to OCD resubmit my final drafts 3 times. My favorite part about this paper is that I do make a bunch of assumptions that you probably shouldn't all take with a grain of salt. So I want to open it up to discussion.
Real quick, before we open generally to everyone, we happen to have several Greek experts in the room. So I would like to give those people a chance to respond. So if any of you have any questions or comments, we'll let you have the floor first, and then we'll open it to everyone.
Dr. Shelton should go first because he has seniority.
He said, what? I can't hear you.
Heard that. Well, I noticed in this presentation that you are dressed in black. And I want to know if that's because you're a mortician here to bury Aktionsart or an assassin to kill it.
I'm dressed in black because I knew presenting this paper would be my funeral.
very good presentation, and I think you showed the dilemmas. But in defense of biblical scholars, I would say to the macro linguistic community, when you guys make up your mind, come talk to us. But I thought that this was helpful here. Yeah, when I was reading Campbell's book, I was going, why are you even talking about Aktionsart? Because that's confusing. What Aktionsart is that means that this particular tense is designed to indicate something continuing or immediate, like, you know, lightning usually strikes like this. But electricity keeps going, ergo the computer works. So, like the imperfect tense in English, I was running the fun run. There was a cruel I was running the fun run. That is durative, that's continual, and was running lends itself to an habitual thing, imperfective, i.e. not completed. And the imperfect tense lends itself to that. And okay, that's true. You're going to be hard-pressed to find imperfect tenses that don't do that, although there are some exceptions. But if you go with this aspectual thing, you don't need to even think of Aktionsart, that something is definitely embedded in the imperfect tense, that it has to be this way. And there was one a thing in your Luke 5:1. No, in your Mark 1:41. You have those aorist tenses, and then you have he says, which is usually considered imperfective, continual. Like I could say, I eat. Am I eating right now? Why did I use the present tense? Well, I have, I have. But I ate would be simple past. But it's there, he did all of these things, and then he says. He says. And the intent there is not that he's continually saying this over and over and over. Oftentimes the historic present in Greek will be functioning sort of like quote marks. And also Luke uses the imperfect tense, elegant. He was saying in a similar way, that he's not continually saying things. Although I don't think that you can assume that imperfect tense is meaningless. Sometimes it's something's done over and over and over. So I think that you're onto something, that maybe we could put Aktionsart aside. Do we really need it to describe what we see happening in the language? And I think I tend to agree with you. Poor York, I knew him well. We'll put him away. One thing I noticed, however, with perfect aspect versus imperfect aspect, the perfect tense, usually a continual action with existing results. Like we used to say, Billy Wilson has paid the light bill. He did it last month. But why did I say has paid instead of paid? Because the lights are still on. There's a continuing effect here. And Wallace, I think, calls this, Mounce calls it a combinative aspect here. It seems to me that with your perfect and imperfect aspect, the way you put them on one side or the other, I don't think perfect necessarily fits comfortably, the perfect tense fits comfortably in this perfective aspect, because it's got both. And I think that might be a weak point in what you're saying here. Any comments on that?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you. I was really looking forward to this conversation. I'll break this down to the few things. Concerning the remarks about why the aorists and then suddenly a present, if we decide to assume the definitions of either viewing the action as a whole perspectively or not choosing to mark that, by then using a present tense, that is opening that perspective to an unspecified. So what we do in the narrative was we're marking this happened, this happened, this happened, speech. So in the same sense, we're saying the same thing. Because especially when you're saying about the elegant, using that imperfect, what we're doing is we're actually transitioning away from something that is narratively perfective in aspect, inserting the elegant, which kind of interrupts things because that is imperfective now, and you're saying it functions as a quote mark. I would suggest it does for the definitional reason that it opened the perspective and made it unspecified.
Because it's unspecified.
Right.
So tell us what tenses you think are specified and which ones are unspecified.
The aorists, I believe, are specified. The perfects and the pluperfects.
Okay, which is really the opposite of what we were getting out of Mounts and Wallace.
Right. What I found,
which is that the aorist is the unspecified, but you're saying it is marked, right?
And by marked, I am talking about with respect to the structuralist school of how they define what a grammatical opposition is. I would have to look into what Mounts is actually meaning when he's using marked, or if he's just using a pedagogical tool and a language to help somebody understand.
I don't think he says marked, but he says it's, the aorist is sort of undefined.
Yeah, undefined. And he also calls
the
the
default
future.
position.
Yeah. And then there's, when you were describing the Aktionsart to everybody, what that really recalls is almost a conflation of Aktionsart with tense. In other words, saying, if I use a certain tense, it inherently suggests that the action occurred a certain way.
And you can't say always.
Not always. But if we're going to make something grammatical, I tend to just personally prefer less exceptions. That is a personal thing, and I do acknowledge that. I think the solution is, if we're going to embrace that perspective, we would need to give people a really good reason to believe that these exceptions deserve to be labeled as exceptions, and give them an actual motivation and reason for why we can treat these as exceptions and not introduce arbitrary exceptions in other places. There is one quote that I immediately thought of when you said something, and it has to do with the history of why it's really confusing. This is from Binnick. When Streitberg used the term Aktionsart, kind of action, or moded action, he was simply creating a technical term for aspect. So it doesn't do no harm to replace his Aktionsarten with Aspekte auf Deutsch in German. But what Streitberg meant was not rendered explicit by this terminology. So some scholars who followed Streitberg then understood Aktionsarten to be defined, or primarily definable, in formal, that is, morphological and syntactic terms. So it split off from Streitberg. And so I think the current language we use to talk about Aktionsarten has more to do with tense now than it does with aspects as a whole.
Tense, i.e. time.
Not time per se.
Okay.
Tense as in the forms.
As in the form.
Yes.
As in sigma, alpha.
Right.
Nu,
Or theta, eta, nu in the middle of a verb, yeah. So in some sense, we definitely then would agree on the use that there is intersection, or at least at a minimum overlap, in the way we choose to use Aktionsart with either aspect or tense.
Are you done, sir?
I
Well, you could go all night. But when I was doing my doctoral studies, this was right about 2 or 3 years after Porter released his big book. And I was taking a class with D.A. Carson on verbal aspect. And when the whole course was over, I asked a question. I said, okay, given all this, how many places are there in the New Testament where we fundamentally have to change our understanding of the passage? And he just said immediately, 6. And knowing him, that was actually a real answer. wasn't flippant. He figured there were 6. And I think a lot of times, you know, we get so hung up in these sort of language discussions of language. And at the end of the day, it gets to be, you know, just all sorts of, you know,
Ruthlessly pedantic.
yeah, it's just spaghetti, you know, and I think what ends up happening sometimes is, I had a conversation with Campbell once. He just did a book on something to do with Pauline epistles. And a lot of it was using his discussions of his understanding of aspect and all that kind of stuff. So I said, okay, so tell me, I may go buy your book, but what are you going to tell me about Paul that St. John Chrysostom already hasn't told me about Paul? And his answer was, nothing, but I'll say it more precisely. And at the end of the day, well, again, like you so eloquently phrased, so what? So what if you can describe it more eloquently? Yeah, I agree that we're all trying to read Scripture, but reading Scripture is, you know, fundamentally it's a transaction between the reader and the Spirit. Now, are there other things that go into that? Obviously so. But it makes me wonder sometimes just how useful some of this stuff is. And I was in your path. I was a math major who came to seminary. And don't even get me started on the synoptic problem. That was one of the most egregious, you know, affronts to my mathematical training I've ever encountered. And thus I studied Paul. It's interesting how these kinds of things do catch our attention. And if you, I don't know, Dr. Bunn, did you go to the Greek language and linguistics section at SBL this year?
I did not this year, no.
That is some of the most violent stuff that you'll ever see, because they will fight over aspect. Are there 3 or are there 2? These can get violent. Well, as violent as scholars get. But I think one of the things your paper did, and I'm kind of drawing this down, one of the things I think your paper did was it tried to give a sort of cogent framework for dealing with these things. And in some ways, that Aktionsart column that you had over on the far right of some of those tables at the end, I think, you know, instead of asking the question, does Aktionsart have a place in exegesis? I think, you know, what we're finding here is that what's happening in that column, whatever label we give it, is in some ways exegesis, based on your other 3 categories, first 3 categories. That Aktionsart probably shouldn't be a part of the grid. It should be, you should have just time, tense, aspect, but then have some sort of, you know, enclose it in a circle that's called exegesis. And leave Aktionsart as kind of just sort of, you know, relegated to the trash heap of time. Because it's unnecessary, and the work of exegesis can be easily done just by thinking in those other 3 categories. So I think your paper's done a good service. What I'd love to see you do is go to SBL because I want to see just how violent that would get.
And the black suit. You would need the black suit there.
You would need the black suit. And the accoutrements of the assassins.
All right. Well, now I'll open it up to everyone else. Any questions or comments?
First of all, great job. Really doing this. I did notice in the very, near the beginning, you were talking about how there were a lot of assumptions being made about these different aspects. And you had that one chart with the 9 placeholders and 3 were missing. And I found that to be really interesting because if you're looking at English grammar, you can fill all of those in. Because in English grammar, you don't only have the progressive and the perfect, you also have the simple, right? And the simple is tied up so closely with the temporal. So I'm wondering if those assumptions, now I don't know about your sources and how many of them come from an English source, but I'm wondering if those assumptions are coming from the point of view of English grammar. And, you know, since we're trying to translate the Greek into English, you have these assumptions from the English grammar that are maybe getting transferred into this linguistic study.
That's a super good question. Because there is there was actually at one point I had to cite, that I found a really excellent source. And it's basically an English grammar recognizing that a lot of these issues we have between balancing understanding the Greek grammar and then rendering our understanding in English is inherently broken by the fact that English doesn't play well with Greek. And so there was a really interesting study about. So on that point, yes, the English simple, and that's what gave me a massive headache, is because I'm thinking to myself, English has room to say, I am eating, or simply I eat. They're both present tense, but one definitely suggests a perspective that's different than the other. And Greek doesn't have that morphologically. They don't make that category. And so whenever we try to make a translational decision, we tend to just kind of put that helping verb in. And as I was reflecting over that, I began to wonder how much of our problems with understanding this are just symptomatic of the fact that the languages don't even play nice. We're having English exegesis issues. We're not having Greek exegesis issues.
To respond to that, if I may, we originally had problems in Greek grammar because we got Greek through the lens of some Latin scholars, and they were using Latin grammar and forms to analyze Greek, and it didn't quite work. For example, they assumed there was such a thing as a gerund in Greek, and there's not. But we do have aspect in English. And I'd say every other day, English and Greek plays well. That's why
in every other one,
personally that it's easier to go from English to a Indo-European language than, say, a Semitic language or another. But we have, for example, we have aspect, and we'll use past tense, and it means nothing. For example, have you ever had a good night's sleep? Well, you're not a good student, you never had. And you wake up and you stretch and you say, man, that felt good. Felt schmelt. You were comatose. Why are you using the past tense? Well, the reason why you're using past tense is we're using that past tense to indicate a perfective, that is, completed action. Because you were comatose. What do you mean it felt good? You mean it feels good because you have something has been completed. So we use aspect all the time. And if you analyze the way your parents talk to you, you'll see aspect all the time. Like, I have spoken. Well, let me translate that. Shut up. Yeah.
Let's see. Let's go Dan, Jennifer, Kyle.
Hi. So, as if this weren't pedantic enough,
Yes, I know.
I have a definitional question. Could you switch to the Aktionsart? I may have just missed this, but there we go. So you kept using the phrase type of action, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out what you meant. You gave some examples, so I kind of get what you mean, but what do you mean by type of action?
As you asked this question, I realized there's a bullet point in my notes that I simply just did not say. So let me read that, because that's exactly what that is. Yes. To borrow Campbell. A verb's Aktionsart is conative if it depicts an attempted but not accomplished action. Gnomic if it, quote, depicts a timeless and universal action. Ingressive if it, quote, depicts the beginning and subsequent progression of an action. Iterative if it depicts a repeated action. Progressive if it depicts a process or action in progress. Punctiliar if it depicts a punctiliar action. That was my personal favorite. Stative if it depicts a state. Or summary if it depicts a process or action in summary. So the assumption here is type of action is describing the different kinds of actions that we know exist because we live in a real world with real actions that we describe.
Okay, my question comes from the perspective of a layperson. Never studied Greek a day in my life. But if I follow what you were saying, Greek does not, when you say it doesn't play well with English, there are not always going to be straight parallels between how we say something in English and how it refers to Greek. Is that, first of all, is that first step correct? Okay. Well, I studied Romance languages, and it's kind of nice because if you know anything about Latin, you can kind of find a range of French and Spanish and, you know, just hit most of Europe. Is there another language? Is there another model out there that would help people understand Greek in a more parallel to Greek than from English?
I would suggest Hungarian and Russian.
Wow. Okay.
I would say more Russian than Hungarian because Hungarian is from
Real loud again.
I would say Russian because when we talk about Hungarian, we're talking about the different family languages.
Okay.
That's my personal opinion. My first language is Bulgarian, which is Slavic, but not quite as Russian.
Well, that was Benedikt's default.
Yes.
Was
the Slavic.
Was Slavic language, and you can't. Greek is a cousin to the Slavonic languages, and that was, I think that discussion in Benedikt was helpful.
Yeah.
So would that mean that Slavic biblical scholars would have a leg out on English speakers when it comes to parsing everything and figuring out what the heck is going to be?
Except when it comes to the definite article, which they don't have. Like that.
Okay.
Okay.
You okay with that? Just due to time, I might ask if you have other questions that you talked to Scott after, but I want to respect everyone's time since we're about 6:15 now, if that's okay with everyone. Scott, are you welcome? Or are you
Yeah, I'll raise it. The thing is, if someone comes up to me and says, hey, I want to talk about your grammar paper, I will yap with you for hours. So please.
Well, we might go ahead and wrap up
Yes.
the formal part of this, and then we can allow everyone to share. I'll have a few questions that I'll send to you later as part of the conversation. Just want to offer some commendation as we wrap up. When you first came to me with what you were wanting to do, and then of course came back to me with what you were changing it to, and then on and on. I was just impressed because, let's be real, senior paper's a hoop you jump through at this stage in the journey for a lot of people. It's you're just trying to get that out of the way. Everyone's terrified of it, and you decided you wanted to take on not only a really complex topic, but at a very high level. And I was just impressed. I was a bit worried that you might be putting too much on yourself, but I was impressed nonetheless. And I'm just impressed seeing the finished product. This is extremely high level work. Your engagement with the literature on the linguistic literature, the biblical scholarship in particular, your proposal for alternative solutions, your recognition of the problem, just really impressive work. Your ability to look at the detail and to see how important it is, and just, again, really high level at this stage in the game. And beyond that, you're an amazing learner and an amazing teacher. You made this accessible as it could be to this audience here tonight. You helped us to follow along with what you were saying. I assume if you gave anyone the title ahead of time, they would assume they would have to be completely lost throughout this presentation. But my guess is most were able to more or less follow along with what you were saying. That's really an impressive gift. I haven't seen that side of you, so I want to commend you on that. And then one of the things that really stuck out to me, was it yesterday? This week's blur. You were saying that you wanted to know if, you wanted to make sure that people such as Shelton could be here because you knew that they might disagree with what you were saying, and you wanted to have that engagement in that conversation. It just showed me your pursuit of truth. Like you don't hold this personally. You want to pursue the truth, and you want to be challenged if what you're saying is not right. And I just commend you on that because if you go to these sections at SBL that Dr. Lent talked about, you can often see a lot of arrogance and pride in some of these people. They want their way to be right, but that definitely your humility came through clearly. Your pursuit of truth. So I commend you on that. And I commend you on a job well done. Thank you for sharing with us here tonight. Congratulations.
Thank you.